when I am gone. Don't you cry for me, don't you pity my sorry soul. What pain there might have been will now be past, and my spirit will be whole. I'll be on my way. I'll be on my way. I'll have left my feet of clay upon the ground. I will be glory bound. I'll be on my way. When I am gone, don't you cry for me, don't you pity my sorry soul. The pain that might have been will now be past, and my spirit will be whole. I'll be on my way. I'll be on my way. I've left my feet of clay upon the ground. I will be glory bound. I'll be on my way.
The Brethren Voices of March 2023 featured It All Started with an Idea, the story of Dan West and the idea known as Heifer Project. His efforts assisted the survivors of war-torn Europe with livestock to revitalize the agricultural needs of Europe following World War II. Hello, this is Brent Carlson. Welcome to Brethren Voices. Today, we feature the granddaughter of Dan West, Barbara West, who shares another vital service, hospice care, for those who are terminally ill. Barbara, welcome to Brethren Voices.
Thank you, Brent. It's great to be here with you today.
I'm very excited because I've been wanting to do a program on hospice care for a long time because I think it impacts almost everybody who's alive today at the time when they may not be living much longer. So we need to know about these things.
Well, and like we say, no one's getting out of here alive. So
Exactly.
end-of-life issues are relevant for all of us at some point.
And we seem to often put them aside and put them away and not really talk about it. So today I'm hoping we can talk about it.
We will.
But first, tell me a little bit about your background, where you grew up, where you went to school, how you became interested in hospice.
Yeah. So I grew up mostly in Bloomington, Indiana, and Indianapolis, and then I finished high school out in Davis, California. I went to Swarthmore College, and I was very interested in psychology, starting off in college, but I studied the French feminists who convinced me that the body is essential, that how we exist in the world manifests through our body. So I decided to become an obstetrician.
Oh, really?
And I went to the Frontier Nursing Service in Kentucky. It was the first place I ever saw babies being born, and I was a courier driving blood samples around on these roads that were well paved because of coal money. And
But still backcountry.
it was backcountry, but with well paved roads.
Oh, yeah.
But and that's where I saw midwives in action, and I saw obstetricians, and I realized I wanted to be present with people, not be just the one doing surgery or managing a team of midwives, or working with a team of midwives. So rather than go to medical school, I went to Yale School of Nursing for midwifery training, and I only wanted to get my RN license just as a byproduct of becoming a midwife. I never wanted to deal with old people or sick people, just healthy mothers and babies. So it's just kind of ironic that I ended up being a hospice nurse for the past 27 years.
I think that's very ironic.
Yeah.
Well, I'm sorry, I don't really know what an obstetrician is.
Obstetrician is someone who works with pregnant women and helps babies come into the world.
Okay. And I know about midwifery because there's a program on Netflix called The Midwife. And I've been learning a lot about what they do. And
Yeah.
they're working with a doctor and
Yeah.
And they're kind of integral into the whole birth process.
But the interesting thing is, I was interested in home birth midwifery, and hospice is home death. By and large, it's where people live. So if they're living in a facility, by and large, they'll die right where they've been living, or if they live at home, they'll probably die at home. And so there's a lot of parallels between the home birth that I was interested in and home death, which is what I do work in now. But the hospice movement is socially sanctioned in our culture at this time, whereas home birth is still considered pretty radical, and there's been some challenges for midwives who are working that way.
Well, hospice wasn't always well accepted, I don't think.
That's right.
You know, I was thinking about this, that I had never really been with a person who died until I was about 50 years old. But I had read and had gone to a lecture by Elizabeth Kubler-Ross about death and dying. And she had a fascinating perspective that it's okay to talk to people who are dying, and it's important to talk to people who are dying. But I had never done that, and then several years later I had an experience of being with somebody who died. But most of us, it's not part of our experience.
Well, that's how it's been for about the past 100 years. Once we invented modern hospitals, both birth and death got displaced there by and large. And so the modern day hospice movement in the US has been around since the early 80s. And so little by little, we're developing cultural experience with that. And so now when I'm going to a new hospice patient's home, often the family will have had another family member that has been on hospice, and they've had some positive experience. So we're starting to build some cultural knowledge again.
Okay, well that's very good, because it makes it a little bit more acceptable and understandable what's going to happen. So
Yeah.
I'm hoping we can talk about those things today.
Yeah, and there was a stereotype, and still in some places, that hospice kills people, and it's nice that I'm not confronted with that fear anymore, very often anymore.
Oh, very good. But boy, if you had to deal with that, it's like, ay.
Yeah.
What a beginning to
Yeah.
have to sort out.
Yeah.
In that realm, can you give us an overview of what hospice is and what hospice does?
Sure. So the fundamental thing to know about hospice is that we work as a team. So anybody who's on hospice has a team of folks that are caring for them, and it's a multidisciplinary team.
So not just hospice people, but
Well, within hospice.
Within hospice.
hospice. So often the most visible hospice staff member is a nurse, typically a registered nurse like me. But the Medicare hospice benefit requires to have a team of people serving the patient and the family. And so that team is going to include a nurse, a social worker, and then some kind of counselor or spiritual caregiver, which is typically a chaplain. But another key member of the team for most patients and families is the hospice aide, sometimes referred to as a home health aide, but someone who does personal care and bathing. Then we have nutritionists, we have physical therapists, sometimes speech therapists, and we have a physician who is working to help coordinate the team, and the physicians will sometimes make home visits as well. So hospice care is not done with just one isolated caregiver.
Well, I would never have known that. So when you talk about a team, you're talking about a real multidiscipline team.
Yeah.
So how does one qualify for hospice?
So again, hospice care is in the United States is generally paid for by Medicare or similar insurance plan, but the way Medicare defines the hospice benefit kind of drives how we set up hospices in the United States. And the criteria is that you have a terminal illness with a prognosis of 6 months or less.
Okay. And then that qualifies you to open the door to discuss hospice services.
Yeah. But the sad thing about it is, due to our culture's fear of death and ongoing denial of death, most people don't get referred to hospice until they have just a couple days or weeks to live. And as a hospice intake nurse, sometimes I'm going out to see somebody and they've already died the morning before I get there.
Wow.
So our ability to grasp when someone has 6 months or less is still pretty limited within our culture and among physicians and other healthcare practitioners.
Well, that's a pretty difficult diagnosis to really to predict it in some cases. So although I know
Yeah.
some people get a diagnosis or a range to say, well, you're going to live 6 to 9 months.
And the nice thing is, as the Medicare hospice benefit evolved in the 80s, they realized, it's not possible to predict that with accuracy, and so we have some flexibility. So at any given moment, a hospice patient has to appear to have 6 months or less, but sometimes folks improve quite a bit with hospice care. So we may have someone on our service for 6 months, and they're still with us, and we reevaluate at that time. And if at that point they still have a prognosis of 6 months or less, they can stay on hospice longer. So I have had patients for a couple years. And sometimes folks get so much better that they graduate off of hospice, but then they could come back on again at a future time.
Because it's Medicare related, is it pretty similar in all the states?
I think so. I mean, the Medicare benefit is a federal benefit.
And the guidelines are federal guidelines?
Yeah, and then you will have Medicaid for folks that aren't covered by Medicare. Medicaid may chip in for folks with lower incomes, and that can vary state to state. One of the things that varies a lot, though, is what the daily rate that the hospice is going to be paid. And that's a very controversial topic, and the way that rate is set is kind of, it may be county by county, but the dollar amount that the hospice is going to get for every day they have a patient on service varies dramatically from one place to another. And what I forgot to mention also is a bereavement team is an integral part of hospice care. And so if a patient does die on hospice, then the family, the survivors are going to be receiving care for the following year. And there's all kinds of bereavement support for the community that hospices provide, but a lot of that care is funded through their own fundraising because the Medicare benefit doesn't provide a lot of extra money for that. But what the Medicare benefit does mandate that we provide is any medications related to comfort or the terminal illness, any equipment and supplies also. And so there's a lot of things that are covered within that, and that's again where the success of hospices can vary based on their reimbursement and local costs.
Okay. What would you say is the goal of hospice in general? Or is that a fair question?
Well, when I was a young hospice nurse 27 years ago, I thought the goal of hospice was for people to have a comfortable death at home, surrounded by their loved ones. But I've learned the hard way that the goal of hospice is to get to know that person and their family and to determine their goals. And then our goal is to try to help them realize their goals as much as we can. Okay. And so in some cases, maybe I'm visiting a family from a medically underserved population, and that 911 call, an ambulance ride to the hospital is kind of a ceremonial rite of passage for them. And I used to think that was a failure when that would happen on hospice care, but now I've had to broaden my cultural perspective and see that may be perfectly what that person wanted or needed.
So in some ways, from that perspective, that's their formal way of saying goodbye because they're being handed over to another level of care.
And technically, the way the hospice benefit is designed, we're trying to keep people at home and minimize that kind of medical involvement, but that may not be a cultural fit. Another example of this is working in West Sacramento with conservative Christian Ukrainian families. The fact that we were even talking about a prognosis of 6 months or less was considered blasphemous because only God can know how long someone will live, and the family was actively praying for the recovery of someone who appeared to us close to death. And so those conversations can get pretty complicated, and that's why we need to train ourselves culturally, and it's important that hospices have good representation from within the community for their staff and volunteers. Oh, and volunteers. I didn't mention about volunteers. Every hospice is required by Medicare to have volunteers, and volunteers are such an important part of what every hospice does. a lot of volunteers are providing patient care right at the bedside or chair side or car or wherever people are. But they're also helping us in the office. They're helping with the bereavement program. They're helping with community events. So volunteers are another really important part of the team.
What does hospice do? I mean, what do you actually do? But I understand that's a really broad question.
Yeah.
But in general, if you could talk about it, what hospice does.
Well, the first thing we do is we look closely at a person's medical, psychological, and resource condition and just see, are they terminally ill? Do they have a prognosis of 6 months or less? And are they in a situation where we're able to provide care for them? And that can take a lot of figuring out sometimes. The first few days or weeks that someone's on hospice tends to be pretty medically dominated. Often people come to us in a lot of pain. Maybe they haven't been sleeping. Maybe they're short of breath. Maybe they've had a neurological deterioration and their family is struggling with how to care for them and keep them safe. So there's often, in those first few days of hospice, we're often kind of putting out fires. We're getting comfort meds delivered within a few hours. We're giving the families a folder of information about how to position someone in bed. We're ordering a hospital bed. We're ordering oxygen if someone's having trouble breathing. So when people initially get on hospice care, it often seems like we're medically managing a situation. We're coordinating with their primary care doctor.
For instance, when you're talking about meds, did the doctor have to order the meds?
Yeah.
Okay, so you're suggesting to the doctor or recommending what kinds of things?
We're suggesting to their primary care doctor, but a lot of times primary care doctors don't have the knowledge or the availability to do that hour by hour kind of urgent dosing of medication. So often our medical directors are stepping in to
and they're
provide
doctors
that expertise.
also?
Yeah, our medical directors are our physicians.
Okay.
So it's very medically driven often at first. But once we are able to get a situation stabilized, hopefully they've been referred early enough that they're not dying in the first 24 hours of hospice care, which happens an awful lot. But then once things are stable, that's where these issues of grief and loss, maybe denial on the part of the person who's dying, or maybe some faraway family member, the chaplain's able to visit, and the social worker, the volunteer, and we're starting to get to issues of, is there unfinished business? Sometimes people are struggling to get their finances in order or make funeral arrangements, but often maybe there's an estranged family member or a secret that they want to unburden themselves of, and that's the deeper level of hospice care. It's those kinds of things and those stories that really inspire us to keep working in this field.
In listening to what you just said, I've had 2 aunts who died, who totally different experiences. One was in hospice and got well, as you were saying, and was taken off of hospice. And when she was in a nursing home, and that she went back to her adult community for a brief time.
Yeah.
And I think the hospice care was really good. I actually was there, and they were there 24 hours a day, which I wanted to ask you about. I think is that usual? Well, and I'm not sure how that worked.
Yeah, my guess would be in your aunt's case that she or her family members hired private caregivers around the clock. And hospice care in general in the U.S. is routine home care. And so the hospice workers are only visiting intermittently for an hour or so at a time. But we're there to make sure there is a 24-hour caregiving in place. So we may be training the family or helping them to privately hire people. There are some rare instances called continuous care where there's a crisis of symptoms and hospice staff will provide care most of the time around the clock, but that's extremely rare and only for a very limited time. Yeah.
Are there levels of hospice?
That's right. So the Medicare hospice benefit provides routine home care, which is 99% of what hospice care is. There's the continuous care benefit to provide resolution of a symptom crisis in the home. And for extreme cases, we have what's called the general inpatient benefit. And that's where we're not able to get somebody comfortable at home, and we actually admit them to the hospital for, a certain period of time. It's evaluated every 24 hours to try to use the tools available in the hospital to get them comfortable and hopefully bring them back home. And then the other benefit is called respite care. And that's where a caregiver is maybe has a medical procedure themselves, or they need a break, or they need to go on vacation or attend a funeral perhaps. And so hospice will pay for placement in a nursing home for about a 5 to 7 day period if it's available. It's very hard to arrange in this day and age with short staffing at most nursing homes, but that is technically part of the hospice Medicare benefit.
If you have someone in your family who looks like or sounds like or may be appropriate for hospice, what do you do? What's the referral process? Because I have,
Yeah.
I think another aunt was eligible, but we didn't know anything about it.
Yeah.
Didn't call anybody.
Yeah.
She died in the hospital, and she could have probably died at home if we had known what you're telling me
It
now.
still happens all the time, and you would ideally, a patient's physician recognizes that they're within 6 months to the end of their life and refers to hospice, but it doesn't happen a lot of the time still. And so it's important to know that anyone can call hospice. You can just call your local hospice and say, I think I'm eligible for hospice, or I think my loved one is eligible, and that hospice can talk to you over the phone, and they can even send someone to your home to assess that. Ultimately, a physician is going to have to certify, technically 2 physicians. It's typically the primary care doctor and a medical director. But we've seen cases where the primary care doctor insists that the person is not eligible, but in fact they are. And so it's always fine to just call hospice yourself.
No, when we call hospice, because is there one per county or per city, or so, is there one hospice, or are there multiple providers of hospice?
Brent, I hate to break it to you, but we are living with a capitalist healthcare system. And so we have many hospice providers. I mean, in the 80s, it started as all volunteer organizations. And then once the Medicare benefit came through, they were by and large nonprofits. But now for-profit hospices dominate the industry. And the formerly volunteer and nonprofit ones are, not many of them survive anymore, at least in California and Oregon. And so
So when you look up hospice, you're going to have a lot of
I would
people to call.
advocate that you try to find a nonprofit hospice. I've worked in hospices that were affiliated with large healthcare organizations, and I've certainly seen some excellent care there, but I've tended to find better, more hospice-y kind of holistic care in the organizations that are the freestanding nonprofit hospices. But you can see great hospice care provided by all the different kinds of companies, and you can see not so great hospice care provided by everybody as well. So it varies a lot. People often go with word of mouth. And if you know someone who's had a good hospice experience, then I would look up that hospice.
Is there a rating system like Yelp has or Google has?
I think there are, and there's, and I wouldn't necessarily trust that. I would look for a hospice that has a strong volunteer program and a strong bereavement program, and I would look for a hospice that's providing bereavement services to the community. The hospice I work for provides caregiving resources. They provide a class for caregivers to prevent caregiver burnout, and that's offered to anybody in the community who's caring for a loved one. So those are, to me, telltale signs that this is a hospice that really has the big picture in mind.
Wow, you're really teaching us a lot. At one point, I actually had visited 2 different hospice homes in Portland. One was primarily dealing with AIDS patients, but another one was actually called Hospice House, and it was a residential program where everybody who was there, the residents were all in hospice, and they had a full-time caregiving staff.
Yeah.
So you mentioned something like that, but are those relatively available in other places? Or?
The general hospice houses, like you describe, are pretty few and far between, and I wish it was more available because, as I was saying, it's very difficult sometimes to arrange 24-hour caregiving, and I'm not sure exactly how the reimbursement works for those hospice houses, but I'm so glad that they exist, and I wish there were more of them. And the root word for hospice comes from, hostel. And so we think of hospice as a place, and that's I think where the word came from, but that's not how it's been in the United States. It is more that way in other countries. On the other side of it, a large number of hospice patients that I've served have neurological conditions like Alzheimer's, dementia, Parkinson's. And so I've done hospice visits in quite a few memory care units that have a lot of hospice experience, or some assisted living homes. And so what I've seen is that there are a lot of folks out there who have a lot of experience with hospice care and are providing expert end-of-life care, but you just can't tell from the way their business is set up that they are expert hospice care providers, because it's just part of what they do. The one thing that's tricky is if you're in a Medicare skilled bed in a nursing home, as often happens when someone comes out of a hospital, so you're receiving active physical therapy or rehab care, you can't receive active skilled nursing care, rehabilitation care, and hospice at the same time. It's one or the other. If it's an end-of-life situation, typically those services wouldn't be as beneficial, but it also has to do with being paid out of the same pot. And so there can be some awkward moments where someone's in a nursing home bed being paid for by Medicare, and then maybe they want hospice care, but at that point they'll have to start paying cash, paying their own money for the nursing home care, and that can be extremely unavailable.
Is there such a thing as hospice for children?
There is, and that's one population that I think is quite underserved, because as a culture, it's hard for us to face the fact that children die, and they sometimes do die of chronic illnesses that have a fairly predictable trajectory. But I was lucky. For several years I worked for a hospice in Sacramento that was affiliated with a large health system, and we did have a strong pediatric hospice program. And I was especially lucky that we had a couple nurses on our hospice team that had backgrounds in pediatrics, and so they tended to be the case managers or primary nurses for those pediatric cases, and I was able to kind of apprentice with them just as I was filling in, doing visits or attending deaths. So it was something I was really frightened about when I first got started, but as I went and visited those parents and those kids, I found that hospice care works just as well with infants and teenagers. I remember this one little boy, he was about 8 and dying of a rare cancer, and he was just at peace with it, I mean, he was making these beautiful drawings. The bereavement art therapy program was working with him, and he wasn't upset about it, about the fact that he was dying. It was really hard for his parents, and it was hard for some of us to get used to it, but the child himself was at ease with it. And I've been involved with hospice care for infants. Hospice care with teenagers is a little trickier because they're teenagers, and so you have all those same dynamics, some of the defiance or carving out of identity that any teenager faces, and teenage hospice patients are doing all of that at the same time that they're working on their end-of-life issues.
How do you manage to deal with the sadness and the grief and the anger and frustration and the denial of the families that you're working with?
That's hard. And
the reason I say that is I think that may be much stronger in families with children, but it's probably true for everybody.
But in general, the hospice patients themselves tend to have less issues with that, but it's the people around them that are having a hard time letting them go. And often that anger gets turned towards us, the hospice team. So I've been kicked out of people's homes. I've been told I was killing people. One time I was attending a death. It was about 6 p.m. I just started my night call shift, and I was called to a home in Oakland. I'd never been to the home before, never met the people, and the lady opened the door and said, "You killed him." And that was the start of our visit, as I was there to attend the death and call the funeral home. So
what do you say? What do you say? That was a showstopper for me. Okay, goodbye. Sorry.
That was very early on in my hospice career. I probably didn't say much, which would have been the less you say in that situation, I think, the better. And I I think I just kept saying, I'm so sorry, and I'm here to help, and what can I do, you know? And she eventually led me into the home and showed me where her husband had died in his bed. But, and that's why the team is so important. So I've had situations where it was so difficult for me that I had the chaplain come with me every visit just to support me in being there in the difficult situation. In certain cases, we visit as teams. I mean, we provide hospice care for folks who are registered sex offenders, so we always had 2 people visiting in that home because it was a family situation. But the team approach is one of the main things, and having chaplains and bereavement staff in the hospice team that I can turn to as a nurse myself for my own support. They're trained to provide support for the patients and families, but they provide that for us. And then a couple hospice I worked in, we did have a support group for the direct care providers, and that was just wonderful. And I wish every hospice had that.
You're going through something with families that they may be going through once for the first time. You have been through it many, many times. How do you be sincere and yet not come across as callous? Because you've been, you know the routine, you know what's going to happen, you know what has to be done.
Right. I mean, but individuals are so different, and there's chaos inherent in death. Death is a chaotic process. It's entropy happening. And so it's really clear to us that we're not in control of it. And folks in general appreciate our experience. Patients are so relieved when I say, I've taken care of somebody with this exact diagnosis. I've taken care of somebody who had this exact kind of pain. And they're often asking me to predict, how many days, how many weeks. And I'll just say, well, based on what I've seen in other people, I think we've got a few days here or a few weeks. And so in general, the more experience we bring to that, the easier it is for our patients and families. And people are so individual. I mean, I'm sure there's nurses with, caseloads of 15 patients that are just burned out and just going through things mechanically. But in general, people's individuality is so huge in that moment. And that's what I feel is one of the big privileges of hospice. You're looking at a person's entire life from, it's like skipping to the end of a book, you get to see the choices people make in their living. How does it work out in the end? And that's just fascinating. And I think all of us who work in hospice are amazed by that every time we meet a patient and family.
Can you recall anything, a particularly unusual or difficult situation you were in, and share something about that?
In terms of difficulty, I would say those cross-cultural situations, working with African-American families who had grown up in Oklahoma maybe before they moved to the Bay Area, and their father or grandfather was denied dialysis because he was black in Oklahoma in the 1930s. And so there's a fundamental mistrust of white healthcare providers for very good reasons. And so you're taking care of a 70-year-old woman who's dying of cancer, but her sister wants to be sure that I'm not just limiting her access to treatment. I'm convinced that I'm providing with her with the best care and the care she wants, but that's a case where the sister did kick me out of the house. It was a patient I was quite close to, and I loved her and providing care for her, but the sister forbid me from coming back, and another nurse had to come because the sister didn't like what I'd said about how long I thought she had left and whether or not we were going to take her to the hospital for certain symptom things that we were able to manage at home. And so I felt ashamed of the cultural history and my part in it, just because of who I am and my race and my class and educational privilege and geographic privilege, and just sad that I wasn't able to follow through with this patient I really loved.
I was in the room once with a family whose doctor had to tell them their loved one was not going to get any better and treatment wasn't going to help, and wanted them to agree to comfort care. And he did a very good job, and he was very sensitive about it, but it's moving to comfort care, that was in a hospital. Would you say moving to comfort care is what hospice does?
Yeah, but there are a lot of folks in hospitals who get moved to comfort care without the benefit of a full team of hospice care folks, sometimes,
But they would be eligible. You would
yeah,
think they would be
they
eligible.
would, but sometimes there are just awkward situations. People don't get referred, and sometimes it has to do with limitations in caregiving, that there's not the ability to take someone home because there's not someone who's physically or mentally able to provide 24-hour care. But in general, hospice care, comfort care, it's kind of equivalent when we think of the goals of care and the kinds of medicines and equipment we'll use.
Okay. Barbara, you're talking about such delicate and subtle things. I'm just amazed about the quality of what you can talk about. We're meeting with Barbara West, who provides hospice services to individuals and families and has 27 years of experience doing so. Barbara, when we've talked about all the different things that families go through, and the pain and the suffering and denial and aggression, and how do you deal with those things, from the disappointment and the depression or the sadness and all a myriad of emotions? How do hospice workers handle that, and how do they get the help they need?
Yeah, I get that question a lot, because when people hear I'm a hospice nurse, they're like, oh, I don't know how you do that. And what I always say is, I don't know how oncology nurses do what they do. I mean, when you're in a nurse working in a field like oncology, you're trying to cure people, and your success rate is going to be low in a lot of cases. And in hospice, our success rate is high because we're trying to help people have a comfortable death, and by and large, we're able to do that. And so we're not having to go through that transition of, can we cure? Are we having to transition to hospice? When people come to us, we know it's a terminal illness, so we're starting with that from the beginning. And so I think that's makes it a lot easier emotionally, that we're not dealing directly with the disappointment of a cure that didn't work. And Ram Dass has a quote. He says, death is like taking off a tight shoe. That in this life, we have all our neuroses, and we're struggling in so many areas. And then when we finally come to the moment of death, it's just about ease. And that is by and large my experience. I've certainly attended some deaths that were difficult or challenging, but in general, people on hospice are able to die according to their wishes in the environment of their choice, surrounded by the ones they love, and it's just thrilling to be able to help that happen. So it's not as depressing as you would think. The part that does sometimes get us down is just dealing with the bureaucracy, the amount of forms we have to fill out, the amount of time we have to spend justifying a terminal prognosis or justifying some equipment that we think we need to prevent a pressure sore that may be expensive and may not be within the budget of a small agency. And so it's those bureaucratic things that can be difficult. The team dynamics can be difficult sometimes too, when we have different practice styles, or you might notice a team member is attached to a family in a certain way that maybe crosses professional boundaries, and we're having to negotiate that as a team. Those kinds of things are really challenging. So.
You have a personal experience in your family with someone who wanted to have some control over their life and was losing it, and did something rather radical. Would you mind talking about that?
Yeah, so you're talking about my grandfather, Dan West, and he had ALS, or what was called Lou Gehrig's disease, which is progressive paralysis. And the thing with that disease is that mentally you're not affected by and large. So he was clear of mind, but was slowly losing his bodily functions and ability to move or talk or swallow.
And does it sometimes affect the breathing, difficult breathing?
Yes,
too?
eventually ALS, if it's progressing, will eventually paralyze the breathing muscles. And so, but this was back in 1971, and he had a feeding tube placed, which if it was in modern times, he might have opted not to do that. But at that time, I'm not sure the option was presented. He was in a nursing home. And as we know, Dan West was someone who was a doer and wanted to be contributing to the world, and he didn't see a value to living out his life in a nursing home. So it was wintertime in Indiana, and he took a walk in the snow. He just managed to go out an exit door of the nursing home, and the staff found him out there, and he did contract pneumonia and died not long after that. And that was a story that we grew up hearing in our family, and there was a certain sense of pride that, like, yeah, we're very utilitarian, and we're here to serve the world, and if we can't be of service, it's time for us to go. And I've had to challenge that myself as I'm looking at what am I even accomplishing as a person in the world now, even though I don't have a terminal illness, and then looking at care I've provided for patients with dementia living for years or decades sometimes, and I can see some of the joys that have been there for those patients and their caregivers, so I challenge my grandfather's thinking after the fact. Maybe I would have liked to have my grandfather around a little longer, but I also respect his choice.
Mm-hmm.
Prior to starting in hospice care, I had done some spiritual self-development work where we did a lot of intensive training on being present. We would sit across from somebody and practice being fully present with that person and being fully present with ourselves. And that ended up being my biggest asset as a hospice nurse. When I first started hospice, I had very minimal training, and I would show up at deaths. I didn't really know what to do, but I had a little checklist on my little notepad, and I just was present with what was going on because I didn't know what else to do. And that turned out to be the main thing that was required for many, many hospice situations. And so I just see that the hospice movement itself is actually radical for our culture as a whole, because by being open to end of life and dying, we actually are forced to be open to our own feelings, and that's actually our task as a culture.
Mm-hmm.
And so by working in hospice for all these years, I've had more practice dealing with my own feelings and other people's feelings, and I think our culture as a whole is getting more practice. And so I think, aside from the benefit of end-of-life care that hospice provides, it's helping us learn to be more present with our own feelings.
I think that's a big challenge, and I know there's other cultures that have the same challenge. And yet there's other cultures where death is, grandma's not doing well, she's in the back room, we visit with her, the kids come and see her after school, we take her soup, and we know she's not going to be here long, but we're really happy to have her with us.
And that happens in the U.S. I've had the privilege of serving Pakistani families that were running a motel in West Sacramento. And so as their hospice nurse, I was just basically a witness to these intact cultural rituals that had been transported from Pakistan to here. And I saw the grieving and ceremony and these layers of ritual and lament that are so powerful and so healing. And so it was a privilege to me to get to witness that. Those families didn't need a lot of help from me other than technical things, but I got to be part of that and see how that cultural richness supports that expression of feeling and acknowledgement of feeling.
I remember a quote from Ram Dass. She said, "You don't have to worry about death. It's perfectly natural."
And that's the thing. And we're successful, as in contrast to my midwifery training. Midwifery is fraught with, what if something happens to the baby? What if something happens to the mother? And even if a baby survives, there could be brain damage or physical damage. And so in contrast, hospice care, the person's supposed to die. We don't have the malpractice liability issues and all of that. So we used to have a bumper sticker at the hospice where I worked, support hospice cares. And I was like, that's a nice bumper sticker, support hospice cares. But I always wanted to have a bumper sticker that said, death, try it, you'll like it. Because, and I know it sounds maybe callous to say, but when you look at the suffering that's incurred in so much of the care we provide, the ICU stays and what goes on, hospice care is like taking off a tight shoe in so many cases.
Barbara, can you think of any other stories that you'd like to tell that would be helpful to illustrate some of the things we've been talking about?
Well, there is one story I'd like to tell, and the patient himself told me to tell it, so I'll follow his mandate here. It was an elderly gentleman in his 80s. He was part of a wealthy farming family in Northern California, and he was just a deeply good man, pillar of his community. and he had a terminal cancer. He was the caregiver for his wife who had dementia, and so as he was dying, he put care for her in place, gathered the family around, and he had a little hospital bed in his bedroom, and he had a little trapeze on it. And every day he would do little chin-ups on his trapeze. He was bedbound, he couldn't get out of bed, but he liked doing his little chin-ups on his trapeze because he could still do that, and he enjoyed every day just seeing the sun come in his window. And one of my last visits with him, he was still conscious, and he said, "Barbara, I'm surprised at how little I've suffered, and I want other people to know this." He said, "I have terminal cancer. I can't care for my wife anymore. I'm bedbound. I can't get out of this bed. But I'm not suffering, and I want other people to know that." So I went to his funeral service after he died, and I stood up and said, "George wanted you to know he was surprised how little he suffered."
Barbara, it's been wonderful having you on Brethren Voices. Thank you so much for coming.
Well, thank you for having me, Brent. It's just been great to talk to you.
It's been delightful, and it's such an education. For Brethren Voices, this is Brent Carlson.
And Barbara West.
Wishing you peace.
And so to the end, there'll be glory everywhere. I'll be on my way. I'll be on my way. I'll be on my way. I'll lay my crown and on my burden's down. I'll be putting on my crown. I'll be on my way. I left my feet of clay upon the ground. I will be glory bound. I'll be on my way.
Would you like a free European vacation this summer and $150 in cash when you return? That was the essence of a news release issued from the Church of the Brethren Relief Center in New Windsor, Maryland on April 30th, 1946. Many similar ads were circulated throughout the country in newspapers, farm journals, church publications, and word of mouth. Hello, I'm Brent Carlson, and welcome to Brethren Voices. These ads were answered by 7,000 men and boys over the age of 16, referred to as sea-going cowboys. They accompanied and cared for livestock being shipped to war-torn Europe following World War II. Today, we're fortunate to have with us Peggy Rife Miller, who has done much research into this incredible event that occurred just over 60 years ago. It was a huge undertaking with the goal of restoring life to a ravaged Europe. Peggy, it's wonderful to have you with us on Brethren Voices.
Thank you. It's so good to be with you.
I'm very curious about how this all began, and I understand that it began with a man named Dan West, a member of the Church of the Brethren of Indiana, and Indiana is where you're from.
That's where I'm living now, yes.
Can you tell us a little bit about Dan West?
Well, Dan West was a leader in the Church of the Brethren in the early part of the 1900s. And out of his experience growing up in a denomination that taught that all war was sin, and having gone through World War I as a non-combatant, he developed a desire to do as much for peace as soldiers do in war. And one of the things that he ended up doing in 1937 was to go to Spain during the Spanish Civil War. And this was a program through the American Friends Service Committee and the Mennonites and the Church of the Brethren, the three historic peace churches, where they wanted to provide relief to those who were affected by the Spanish Civil War on both sides of the conflict. And while Dan was there in Spain, they were giving out relief supplies of clothing and food, and they were giving powdered milk to children and the supply was limited, and he had to make decisions, triage basically, about which children might die and which children had the strongest possibility of living, to know who to give the milk to. And the story goes that one day, sitting on a hillside under an almond tree, he was looking out over this valley of green hills and thinking that they should be growing cows on that property and they would have milk. And thinking about the farms that he came from in Indiana, that if they could send cows to Spain, then they'd give a cow, not a cup of milk. And the idea kind of caught on and went from there.
Did he present this to his congregation in Indiana at some later time?
When he came home, he started sharing this idea with friends, with family, in his church, in other churches, all around northern Indiana. He shared it with government people, just shared the idea widely.
How long did it take from his idea to come to fruition? And I understand there's probably lots of other people who had to help because it has become a big project.
Yeah, it wasn't an easy idea to sell. A lot of people called it an impossible dream, because when you think of all the obstacles to raising heifers and shipping them during wartime, it took from early 1938, when the idea came to him, until June of 1942 for the first Heifer Project committee to be formed.
And during this time, World War II was still rambling or rumbling.
Exactly. Yeah.
Oh.
I have a website, www.seagoingcowboys.com.
No pauses, no breaks. It's all just one word.
Right.
Cowboys signed up for these trips for a variety of reasons. For some, it was an adventure. For others, an act of service. Some jumped at the chance to see the world, and some wanted to be part of the healing process for a wounded world. Whatever their reasons, it was an incredible opportunity for these men, young and old alike. In many cases, the experience influenced vocational choices in the direction of service occupations, like social work, ministry, or missionary work, and many vowed to work diligently for a peaceful world.
I've been the lone wanderer, rambling free, but there's more to this life that I want you to see. For around every bend, a kind thought and a friend had been there uplifting me. It's a good hearts that spring from the salt of the earth. They inspire and brighten my days, and I owe it all. And I owe it all to the spirit of love and the friends along the way. You saw me stumble and you saw me fall. You lifted me up so I could walk tall. You helped me to stand and you gave me a hand. It's to you I owe it all. Let me hear you now. It's the good hearts that spring from the salt of the earth. They inspire and brighten my days, and I owe it all. And I owe it all to the spirit of love and the friends along the way. And I think of those friends along the way as I sing this song. Of course, But I also think about this experience I had back in 1976. I was just finishing up a year and a half, 5,000 plus mile walk from the Atlantic Ocean out to the Pacific Ocean. And it was all through the northern states and part of Canada, and backcountry too, until I got out to the Puget Sound area. And I for 4 or 5 days, I walked these little dirt lanes around the Sound. And this one day, as I was passing a farmhouse, I couldn't help but notice this beautiful elderly woman standing in the front yard. She was out there tending her garden, and she greeted me. And soon I found myself on one side of the fence, a young man of 21, 22 years old, and her on the other side of the fence in her early 80s. And boy, we just hit it off. We just started trading stories and swapping lies and telling adventures, and it was a lot of fun. We had this good connection, and we gabbed and talked. And I don't know if you've ever noticed this, but sometimes it's easier to talk to a stranger about the things that are really going on in your life rather than talk to somebody that's actually close to you. And so slowly her story kind of came out, and I'd wandered by just at the right time. I'd wandered by just as she was out there saying goodbye to that home that she lived in for 45 years and the garden that she had tended all those years. The place had just gotten to be too much upkeep for them, and they were moving into the big city the following week. And my heart went out to her, and I remember we talked longer, and after about an hour and a half or so, it was time for me to go. And I remember I reached across the fence, I gave her a little squeeze, and I started walking down that dusty lane. And I'd only made it about 20 feet or so when she called out to me, and I stopped, and I turned, and I said, "What?" And I'll never, ever forget this. She said, "Isn't it nice to find a friend once in a while?" Help me sing this last chorus, will you? It's the good hearts that spring from the salt of the earth. They inspire and brighten my days. And I owe it all to the spirit of love and the friends along the way. And the friends along the way. And the friends along the way.